Today, national banking or globalist enslavement? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, Wednesday's post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined today by Sam, who's been digging into our central bank. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Martin. Thanks for having me, mate.
Now, you've been looking at our central bank and how it developed and how it emerged, and you've made a documentary and things on it. What have you found?
Yeah, well, to me, I think there's no more important time than currently to discuss central banking, just because how crazy the world is at the moment. And I don't think a lot of people really understand that the Reserve Bank of Australia actually used to be the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And the Commonwealth Bank of Australia we have today is absolutely nothing like the original Commonwealth Bank of Australia we had during World War I under Sir Denison Miller and World War II with Ben Chifley and John Curtin. So to me, the documentary was basically just getting all the information and just learning the story of Australian history and putting it into the into the public domain. So
right, yeah, no, I think it's a very important story, and of course the central bank, the original central bank, which was the CBA, had a huge role to play in our recovery and rebuild after the war. It was then later transmogrified into a private commercial entity. And because of that, it's lost basically the heart of what it was trying to do. Then we have got a Reserve Bank over there, which is, I don't know, yeah. So it really is a very interesting story. And you're right, most people don't understand it. By the way, it's worth saying, of course, that our Reserve Bank is owned by the government, unlike the Federal Reserve, which is owned by some of the major, international and US-based international banks over there. So, in theory, the Reserve Bank here should be aligned to supporting the broader economy. Interesting debate whether they do. But where do you want to start the conversation in terms of a bit of history? Because maybe that's a good way to sort of just develop the argument a bit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the film itself, it's huge. It goes all the way prior to the founding of the First Fleet, and then monetary policy through then and onwards. But I guess a lot of people don't realise that in 1890, Australia had one of the biggest basically a financial genocide of the 63 financial institutions that called themselves banks. Only 10 of those didn't close down in 1893, and so there was massive bank runs, absolute collapse. And it was from this environment of economic devastation that the idea of government involvement in the banking system actually started developing, started really gaining traction. And I talk a lot in the film about King O'Malley, who was really the driving force in the Australian Labor Party to push the bank. And then in 1911, it finally, under the Fisher Labor government, it finally gets established. And then I talk about Sir Denison Miller's role of establishing the bank from nothing into becoming the prize institution of the Commonwealth. But the film itself is called The Battle for the Bank. And eventually I talk about how the powers of British finance actually hijacked the bank. And it's a back and forth between working for the Australian people versus working for the London bankers versus getting restored and working for the Australian people during World War II again and getting hijacked again. So it's really, to me, it's a part of Australian history that should be I reckon central banking policy should be discussed by everyone, but I reckon it definitely needs much more mainstream awareness.
Sure. Now, well, obviously, we'll make sure that there are links and things to the full show so they can go and watch it, because that's I think part of the story here. But what's fascinating is, we had our first deposit bail-in last century, right? I mean, 1895, right? So basically, and that was in fact, John Adams and I made a show on that some time back, which actually made the point that we were probably one of the first innovative examples of deposit bail-in, and then essentially the Reserve Bank, as it was, or the CBA as a Reserve Bank, basically invested very heavily in infrastructure, particularly after the Second World War, and essentially allowed the economy to grow substantially after the Second World War. And in fact, they borrowed quite a lot, but they were able to grow the economy to be able to repay that back quite quickly afterwards. And so that philosophy of using money, essentially public money, to invest in long-term infrastructure development is something that actually has been done very successfully in Australia.
Oh, 100%. It was during World War II. You know, it was because of the war that the Labor government was actually able to reform the bank, restore it out of British finance control, and actually it was under the National Security Economic Organisation wartime regulations that John Curtin and Ben Chifley were able to establish the bank into this credit-making institution. And under institutions such as the Industrial Finance Department, they basically took the heads of the Australian industry, especially there was a guy called the head of BHP, Sir Essington Lewis. And basically they reorganized Australian industry to finance the war effort. And all these programs, all these development functions, that was basically built with credit provided by the Commonwealth Bank. And if the Commonwealth Bank hadn't been acted and hadn't been in a credit expansionary policy, which was under the, I talk about this in the Great Depression, then none of these programs would have been possible.
Yeah, and I imagine that is part of the story also of the first snowy hydro.
Yeah, I did look into the snowy hydro. I didn't include it in the film perfectly, but it's the idea that so Dennis and Miller himself said, whatever the Australian people can intelligently conceive in their minds would loyally support, that can be done. Because what the power, and I actually, at the end of the film, I actually advocate that we should restore a national bank. To me, I do believe that, you know, the powers over the mechanisms of finance must not remain the exclusive privilege of an unelected cabal of private bankers. You know, honestly, the government should be restoring this power over credit, restoring the note issue back into the hands of Parliament and restoring it to the people to whom it actually belongs. And then once the people have control of the note issue, then it's from this that the expansionary programs can develop. But currently, you know, the note issue is being held by the Reserve Bank of Australia. And who does the Reserve Bank actually really serve? You know, to me, I state in the film that their allegiance is actually to the international Freemasonry of central bankers. So it's not really, it's truly about restoring the sovereign capability over finance back into the hands of the government.
Yeah, I don't know whether you saw Roy Dalio, you know, of Bridgewater, actually made a speech in the last 24 hours, and he basically said that central banks around the world and the Fed in the US basically have lost the plot, and essentially what they're doing is going down a dark alley that may support the financial system and may support the banks, but actually is not supporting the economies. And he's arguing that that's created an even more distorted economy with effectively the rich getting richer and everybody else getting a lot poorer. And he's arguing there has to be a fundamentally different approach to the way that central banks work if we're actually really to get the benefits of that prospective investment to flow to the real economy and real people. And I think he's absolutely right.
Well, definitely. Like currently, there's never been a more insane period of monetary policy in human history. So let's go back to the 2008 GFC. You know, none of the structural problems which had caused the crisis were remedied. You know, all we did was give them a bailout and kick the can down the road. Yep. So what's happened is that all the same problems have reappeared. Only this time they're much larger. And it's like we're trying to solve them with the same bailouts, bail-ins, but one of the fundamental programs is that even we've propped up the stock market so much that it's nothing but quantitative easing and addicted to increased liquidity. But it's not a real development economy. It's all about keeping the financial system alive. Whereas to me, the entire financial system is nothing but a strung out hollow shell. And underneath, you have this dilapidated manufacturing sector. You have the physical economy absolutely collapsing. But, you know, you have to look at it in the larger global picture, more globalized perspective where, you know, I truly believe this is part of some larger central banking, you know, agenda to basically merge the world's economies together into one global centralized monetary system or one world currency.
Right. Well, you should be talking to my mate George, who actually has the same theory. Right now, you know, I'm of the view of you can either describe history as a series of, you know, cock-ups, and I suspect that a lot of it is cock-up rather than actually conspiracy. But there are people out there who actually believe that there is a more thoughtful process of trying to actually steer us into a particular future where effectively the central banks are coordinating activity, and then you overlay digital, and, you know, and so you can make it. I mean, I don't know which is true, but I mean, there are people out there who think that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, well, definitely your program talking about the anti-cash legislation is absolutely spot on. To me, it's 100% they want to make all cash payments digital because number one, it stops the bank runs. Number two, it makes everything taxable. And then number three, they can start doing negative interest rates. And,
Yeah.
interest rates are already at zero or negative. How low can they go? It's really just absolute financial insanity. But to me, I talk about this in the film. The solution to me is restoring control over the monetary policy back into the hands of government so that the government itself is responsible for monetary policy, not the Reserve Bank, which is owned by the government and acts on behalf of the government, but is actually acting for, as I believe, for other interests.
Oh, I was going to say, whether you touched on it in the film, I haven't seen the film, so I can't comment on it. But there's this thing called the Council of Financial Regulators, right? And the Council of Financial Regulators is basically chaired by the Reserve Bank, and it includes the Treasury, and it includes the ACCC, but also APRA and ASIC, right? And it's those guys who sit around the table, basically, and work out what they're going to do. So the question is, how accountable is that particular group, right? Because whilst you could argue that Treasury is some accountability to Parliament, the others less so. And in fact, my perspective is that this Council of Financial Regulators is where a lot of the issues are, because they've got so much groupthink. They're all thinking the same sort of stuff, right? They're all thinking it the same way. And there's no ability to be able to actually question nor indeed, point out alternatives. And by the way, the Council of Financial Regulators, until very recently, didn't even publish minutes of their meetings. They've started to do that now, but have you read them? They're hardly worth reading.
I do talk about the Council of Financial Regulators in the film. You see, after the 2008 GFC, there was a raft of opposition to further bailouts. People found them abhorrent. That's on the surface. Underneath, the central bankers love them, But so what you have this institution called the Bank for International Settlements, and I talk about this extensively in the film. But to me, the Bank for the International Settlements is the nexus of the globalized monetary system. That's where all the central bankers get together and they have these forums, and there's an institution inside the BIS called the FSB, the Financial Stability Board. And the Financial Stability Board is basically, it's a globalized think tank which goes to the national countries around the world and basically prepares them both structurally and legally for the new globalist architecture being prepared by the BIS. And so the CFR was actually established by the FSB as this coordinating, basically a group to coordinate monetary policy in terms of a crisis. So they've centralized all of Australia's monetary policy in really extreme things like bailouts and all sorts of stuff in this central institution. And I talk about in the film how the institution itself, it's headed by people whose allegiance isn't to Australia, but rather to the BIS. Wayne Byers himself sits on the committee for the committee on the global financial, the banking regulator from the BIS. Philip Lowe himself is the chairman of the he's the RBA chairman, but he's also the chairman of the BIS's committee on the global financial system.
Yes.
So it's the BIS to me is really, but I talk about this extensively in the film. The one way to shift it back is to go that monetary policy must be in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the global banks.
And isn't the point there that you've got to ask what's this all for in the first place, right? Because if you think it's only to protect financial stability and the structure of the banks, that's one thing. But if you really believe that it's actually about creating the greater good for the greatest number in Australia, and so basically for ordinary Australians benefiting, then that agenda is a completely different agenda.
Oh, 100%. Well, you have to look at the financial system Australia's existed under for the last decade. If it really was about improving living standards for the people, you wouldn't be having this insane housing bubble. It's been under the RBA's watch that the nothing but credit has gone into nothing but housing and mortgages. And so not only has that stifled any economic growth or activity, it's also stopped. Not only has it made housing unaffordable for young people and old people alike, but it's also stifled all the other sectors of the economy that desperately require finance. And one of the best things about restoring the monetary power back into the hands of government is that through institutions like the Industrial Finance Department, the government can actually provide the credit to support these industries. And to me, I say it in the film that, the tools of government are powerful mechanisms for not only ensuring the liberties of their citizens, but they also have an institution to provide the favorable economic conditions which raise the living standards of the people. And currently, the system we have now is it's more focused on propping up the housing market, propping up the financial bubbles, and meanwhile, living standards are going down as debt rates spike. So it's really about perpetuating the financial system over the interests of the Australian people.
Yeah, and the point, of course, there is, and I was talking to Michael Hudson some time ago, who's an American economist, and he makes the point that with what's going on at the moment, more and more of the debt is on the shoulders of the population, right? Because of the fact that prices have gone up and the amount the banks lend have gone up. But that means there's less and less ability to invest in other things, more productive things. That's the first point. And the second is that the only winners in all of this are the 1%, the people who actually own the shares in the banks, who actually are benefiting from all of the liquidity bits being thrown back into the banking system. So you create this ever greater distortion between the haves and the have-nots. So structurally, something does need to change. And I think the central banking question is really the key to unpacking it. But of course, it's very unpopular. And many people can't question the Reserve Bank. You know, they are sacrosanct. And of course, they know everything because they've got really smart people and lots of PhDs. Well, maybe, but they also happen to be rather well associated with the BIS, as you say, and rather associated with financial stability. And frankly, their track record, if you actually ask them, well, how well did you do over the last few years with inflation targeting and those sort of things, and forecasting, is actually appalling.
Well, to me, one of the fundamental principles of monetary policy, and I'm not really, I'd take an estimate of how many men on the street know this, but the idea that when banks create credit, they're generating currency. The idea that when banks create loans, they're actually generating currency. To me, that's like, I think everyone goes through that process when they understand that system for the very first time. They're like,
yep. Yeah, the penny drops.
Are you serious?
Right? And, you know, Steve Keen talks about that, and the Bank of England published a paper on it. But, of course, the guys at the Reserve Bank don't think that's the way it works. So the Reserve Bank says it doesn't matter how much debt you have, because for every increase in debt, you create an asset, and therefore they cancel each other out. So it's irrelevant, right? So they don't buy that argument.
Oh, they reckon a one-bedroom, one-bathroom house in Wagga Wagga is worth 1.6 million. So that's their definition of stability.
I know, and that's what's interesting, because they've been asked a few times, well, how much debt is too much? Is it? And they said, we don't know. You know, we're not too worried about it. And in fact, there's a housing price model that they've developed. A guy called Peter Chilip from the RBA developed it. And if you look at it, there's almost nothing about debt in the house price model. It's basically affordability. So basically, as rates come down, house prices go up because it's more affordable. I mean, I just have to say, I think that they are probably not on our side, and I actually think that they are not very effective in their own term of reference either. So we need a change. The question of how on earth you catalyse that change, I guess that's the key question.
Well, the things I talk about in the film, the idea of establishing a national credit bank, it's not a revolutionary idea. Australia has actually done it twice before. They did it when Sir Dennis and Miller set up the original bank, and then they did it again when when Curtin and Chifley rescued the bank from the hands of the Sir Robert Gibson's Commonwealth Bank Board. So it's been done before. The Australian government has had control over the note issue. So there's no reason why all it takes is a simple act of Parliament to push the note issue back. And, you know, it can even be a transitionary model. You know, you can have there's thousands of different perspectives and methods, but the fundamental idea is that monetary policy must not remain the exclusive domain of the private bankers. You know, the government should be actively supporting the Australian economy with control over the finance, with control over the systems of finance.
And the point there is that, as you say, it would take political will and political intent. By the way, there are a few politicians, I interviewed one some time ago, who is actually much more on song with that alternative model and believes that things have gone very much off the boil. But I would say that's not a mainstream politically acceptable view at the moment, and certainly from those in power, they're all sucking the same Kool-Aid. So, but you know, we must keep pushing the thought, pushing the thought and the story. Now, tell everybody again the name of your film.
The film is called The Battle for the Bank, Australia's Struggle for Monetary Policy. This is the... there we go. If anyone's interested, I'm actually selling DVDs for $20. You can support me through that one. So
okay, right. Well,
it's free to watch on YouTube as well. So
okay, well, we'll put the appropriate links, and if people want to get the DVDs, great. Look, I've really enjoyed talking with you, and you've put your finger, of course, on some very critical issues. And the fact of the matter is that we are at a critical turning point with regards to central bank strategy and thinking. And I think you're calling out some very important issues. So thanks for your time today.
Thanks for that, Martin. Much appreciated.
Cheers.